Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. We're so glad that you could be with us once again for Stories and Myths. I am your host, Craig von Buseck, and I am happy to be joined this evening by another co-host. And now he didn't put his last name down below in the name place, but by looking at him, you probably could tell that this is my other son, David von Buseck. And I am so happy that David is able to join me as co-host tonight. First of all, hello, David. How are you?
Doing great, Dr. von Buseck. How are you doing today?
Oh, you could just say Dad. That would be just fine as well.
Yeah, that seems better.
Well, good. I'm so glad that you could join with us. And John C. Farrell, who is the normal co-host, had some family things arise and he was not able to be with us this week. He said to say hello to everyone in the audience, but he will hopefully be back with us next week. But that gives me the opportunity to introduce another member of the family, because as you know, Aaron, your older brother, was the co-host last week. And but I'm kind of happy that you're here this week because the subject matter is something that you and I both enjoy. And that is, we're going to be talking about the Revolutionary War. We want to say hello to Kelly Williams Duncan, who writes in that it's clear that he belongs to you. Laugh out loud. We almost look like twins. So, except I've got the gray hair. This is what I looked like in 1989.
See, that doesn't really track because I don't have a perm.
Well, I didn't have a perm in 89. My perms stopped in the early 80s. So, happily so. Well, actually, I think, no, that's not true. I had a wave in 88, but that was the last one, my last wave. But at any rate, we're going to talk tonight about the Revolutionary War, the American Revolution. But before we do, tell us a little bit about you, what you're doing, and you have a keen interest in history as well.
That's right. Right now, I am working for Regent University. I work as an admissions evaluator, just helping students through the enrollment process, which is a really great. It's a really great thing to do. I feel like I'm really helping people along their way, getting moved forward. But yeah, no, I've had an interest in history for as long as I can remember. Now, a lot of that does come from the musical 1776, and
which
just going
is
around
what we're going to talk about tonight. Exactly.
And then also we've been to so many colonial and historic sites around the country. I honestly couldn't even count them if I tried.
Yes, it has been something that has been a family. I guess you would say it's one of the things that we love to do. And maybe it's because I love to do it and you guys got dragged along. But I think some of that passed down to you as an interest as well.
Yeah, that's true. I've definitely been to Colonial Williamsburg without you. So
it's
like it's not just you. It's just you planted that seed there.
Well, that's good. So thinking back over the years, what were some of the highlights of the historical places that we visited that made an impact on you? Obviously, Colonial Williamsburg is one.
Colonial Williamsburg, with living in Virginia, you also do Jamestown and Yorktown. Definitely the Civil War battle sites are up there, especially like Gettysburg, just kind of being up there and seeing that and just looking back on like the toll that took is just interesting. And then for a more lighthearted side of things, Colonial Williamsburg, like I said, it's like stepping into history. It's not something that a lot of people who aren't familiar with it get to do. And so that's something that I really appreciate, the fact that they've preserved it the way they have. And even like, I believe it was the governor's mansion that they found blueprints and rebuilt it like to the specs.
It had been destroyed.
Exactly. And so it's not only preserving the old history, but it's updating and retaining it, maintaining like the I guess character educators, is that the right term that they use?
Interpreters.
The interpreters who maintain those like historical techniques for like blacksmithing, all the different things that they craft and create down there. And it's
right. They actually they make the things that they're working on, and then they sell them in the bookstores.
Yeah.
Which I think is awesome.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, well, excellent. Very good. Well, you and I both have a love for 1776, and I recently was a keynote speaker at the Blue Ridge Christian Writers Conference, and I shared a little bit of the debate scene between John Adams and John Dickinson. Now, do you remember any of that debate scene?
Like the specific words of it, or not offhand.
Well,
that's actually one I've been wanting to rewatch.
Snippet. How about if I give you a little snippet?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Because I played Dickinson, as I recall, when I was in ninth grade, and so the debate scene is they're debating whether or not to break free from Great Britain and declare their independence. So John Dickinson opens up by saying, "Well, sir, you've gotten your way at last. The matter can now be discussed. I confess I'm somewhat relieved. I have a question that I've been fairly itching to ask you, sir. Why?" And you would answer,
"Why what, Mr. Dickinson?"
"Why independence, Mr. Adams?" "For the obvious reason," John Adams answers, "that our continued association with Great Britain has grown intolerable." And Dickens says,
"Intolerable? To whom? To you?"
"Then I suggest you sever your ties immediately, but please be kind enough to leave the rest of us where we are." We won't go into too much more than that, but I love it comes down to the point where they're almost ready to come to blows.
They do come to blows. They're hitting each other with canes by the end of the scene.
Right. Well, they are almost ready to start hitting each other with canes. And Dickinson says, "Now, are these the acts of Englishmen?" And John Adams answers,
"No, sir. Americans."
"Not Englishmen, Dickinson. Americans."
Americans.
Which leads us, which will transition from there into our first question, which is?
So our first question is going to be, what was the cause of the American Revolution?
Well, there had been decades and decades of fighting between the French and the British and the Spanish, who were the three most powerful empires. Portugal was a lesser power, but still a power at that time. And so over the years, they fought for control of the lands all around the world as their navies would go out into the world. And so we know that the Spanish actually were the first to establish a colony in North America. And the oldest part of that is still intact in Florida at St. Augustine. And then almost around the same time, ironically, they were also establishing a fort and a church in New Mexico. And so the Spanish had the first foothold, and then the French and the British came in, and each one laid claim to a certain amount of land. Now, that didn't mean anything other than that they were saying that, well, you know, we're gonna claim this, and if you want to try and claim it, you're gonna have to fight us for it. And we want to just say real quick, hello, my sister, Erin von Buseck staff, says hi again to the other von Buseck, so we say hello to her. So that's what happened, is that each of these empires started to stake out their claim. So the French took the interior of what is now the United States and then took a large swath of what is now Canada. And the British took the eastern seaboard all the way down to Florida, which obviously was Spanish, and started to move in there, both in what is now the United States and also up into what is now Canada. And so that was where everybody kind of staked their claims. Well, in the meantime, and in the midst of all of this, were the Native Americans that were living on these lands, and in some cases, the European powers would give them money or some sort of a trade for land. Other cases, they would just fight for it and they would take it. Although I know that the English really did try to be fair in many cases, and also the French. But in the end, the French kind of gained the hearts of the Native Americans. And so the British and the French had been fighting in Europe, and that spilled over into the New World as they were trying to establish where the boundary lines would be. And so the French convinced the Native Americans to fight on their behalf. And they basically said, we're going to give you your land. We're not going to mess with it like the English have. So if you fight with us, everything will be hunky-dory. So there was a major war that we call the French and Indian War that took place in the 1750s. In the end, that war actually spread all over the world. It was really a world war 200 years before what we had in the 20th century. So in the 18th century, there was this world war between the French and the British that went on for decades. And the estimates are that more than 1 million people died in those battles over all those years, which is hard to fathom that back then that many people could be killed in that kind of a war. But that's what happened. It ended up costing the British so much. It was tremendous cost in lives, in materials, and in money. But in the end, the British won, and they defeated the French, and they pushed the French primarily out of Canada and took over most of Canada, and then continued with the colonies on the east coast of what is now the United States. Well, the cost of this was so exorbitant that it had emptied the coffers in Great Britain. And so King George, who was a little bit nuts, he was an unbalanced person. He was highly intelligent, but he was also highly unbalanced. And so he pushed Parliament to levy what were called different stamp acts upon the colonies. And these were taxes. So they would put a stamp onto a barrel of wheat or flour. They would put a stamp onto a barrel of tobacco or whatever it might be. And every time that went in or out of a port, the colonists had to pay taxes on this. And to them, these were very high taxes, but they were willing to pay because they understood that, well, this gives us protection. We have protection of the most powerful empire in the world, the most powerful army in the world. It continues trade, and that's a good thing. So at first, they kind of put up with it, but the taxes kept getting more and more. They kept getting higher and higher. And then what really bothered the colonists here in America, the American British colonists, was that they had no representation to determine what taxes would be levied upon them. All of those taxes were passed by the Parliament in Great Britain. And so these colonists, they were told that they were English citizens, but they didn't have true representative government. Now, they did have it on the local and the colonial level, but they didn't have it on the federal level. And that is where they started to chafe against what was happening. And it got worse and worse. And unfortunately, instead of negotiating and trying to find some sort of a settlement with the most prosperous colony that England had by far. I mean, it was so much bigger than England, and it produced so much more raw materials. It's almost crazy that the British allowed what happened to happen. But I think a lot of it had to do with King George and his erratic behavior, and also just pride. I think that the Parliament said, well, we're the Parliament, you're not, we're in charge. And so we're going to, pass these laws. Yeah. And they didn't realize the will of the people of America, because the American colonists by this point had been on the continent for 150 years, more than 150 years.
It's generations of people having lived, their families lived here, their parents, their grandparents.
Exactly.
This is their turf, and someone else is basically just saying, you're going to pay this. I do kind of wonder how things may have gone different if they had representation.
You might be speaking with a British accent right now. That kind of went Irish a little bit there. You're better at the accents than I am.
But no, it is kind of interesting. I do wonder if it's like that out of sight, out of mind mentality that the British, like actual in England people had, that they're like, oh yeah, no, like it doesn't even come into their mind how massive America is, because they're just focused on what they can see and what's immediately impacting them.
I think that there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, David, but I also think that colonialism as a system was an arrogant, obnoxious system.
Oh, yeah. And you can't come up with the catchphrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, when you're about the size of New Jersey, I want to say.
What was that? Oh, you mean the England, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what a comparable thing, but it would be compared to one of our states in the United States. And it was ruling an empire that went all the way around the world, like you said. Mm-hmm. They're literally, under Victoria, it got to the point where the sun never set on the British Empire, which is hard to even fathom right now. Yeah. So in the end, the Americans started to rebel. They started to not pay the tax. They started to blockade British military ships. And then when the British military started to move in response, especially in Massachusetts and in Boston specifically, the militias started to be raised all across the country to protect the different areas against the British. And so it was inevitable that there would be eventually a clash. And so then the British started to raid these arms depots and the places where they were keeping their gunpowder, where the militias were keeping their gunpowder, basically trying to disarm them. And that's why the Founding Fathers put in such a strong Second Amendment to protect the right of citizens to bear arms, to protect themselves both personally, but also against a tyrannical government, which is why I am a strong and never-ending proponent of the Second Amendment, because no government should be in a place where it does not have a healthy fear of their people, meaning that they respect the fact that the people are not just going to be bowled over. And that's where tyranny happens. When a government has no respect for its own people, then tyranny takes place. And that's what was happening. And so in order to battle this, the Sons of Liberty, or the Patriots, there's a reason why New England named their football team the Patriots, because they were naming them after these patriotic colonials in Boston who stood up against the British troops in a very bold way, knowing that they could lose their lives. And so one of the major moves was what was called the Boston Tea Party, where people like Samuel Adams, which was John Adams' cousin, and other patriots, Paul Revere and others, they went on to British ships and they threw British tea into the ocean, into the bay, and as a protest against the British. Well, that caused a clampdown of the British, and tempers rose and rose until one day the militia and just regular people came to a screaming match with a regiment of British soldiers, and the soldiers felt fearful for their lives. And unfortunately, they opened fire and killed several of the colonials, and that was called the Boston Massacre. And interestingly, the person who defended those troops was none other than John Adams.
It's an interesting position to be in, someone who believes that your country should be independent, but is also that dedicated to the law and to justice, that it's like, I believe that these people were in the right and defending people who politically you're against, but
Yeah.
morally
Yeah.
you agree
John
with
Adams
their
would not
action.
have said he believes totally that they're in the right, but he believed that they had the right to a fair trial, and they had a right to have their cause brought out in front of a jury of their peers. However, John Adams was greatly conflicted because he was more and more seeing that continued association with Great Britain had grown intolerable. And so that is how it all began. And then not long after that, the sister colonies decided that they needed to get together to discuss what was going on. And so they sent the best and the brightest of the men at that time, because women were not involved in politics and did not have the vote at that time. And so the best of the brightest of the men gathered in Philadelphia for the first Continental Congress. And one of the first things that they did in 1775 was to appoint George Washington, who had been an officer in the British government or in the British Army years before and had fought in the French and Indian War. They appointed him to be general in chief over the army, the Continental Army. Many in the Congress at that point in 1775 merely did this as a protection, but they were not interested in independence. They were looking to put out an olive branch. They were wanting to ask King George for reconciliation. But unfortunately, the British government came down very hard, especially in Connecticut and Massachusetts and in New England, and then down into New York on the colonials. And many in the country who had just the year before thought there's no way that we'll ever leave our association with Great Britain. As Great Britain became more and more heavy-handed, people started to have a change of heart, even though from the standpoint of the colonials, there did not look like there would be much hope for independence, but they were going to fight for it anyway. And their overall hope was that they would have the intervention of maybe Spain or France, which is over time, many, many years went by where where George Washington would hit and run. And so that was how the war began. Just answering, Kelly Williams Duncan writes, "Don't tell Abigail Adams women weren't involved in government and politics." That is true, but it was an unofficial capacity. With the official capacity, it was only men. But Abigail Adams, who I have the greatest respect for, and had women been involved, she probably would have been our first woman president. She was a genius. And she created a lineage of Adams geniuses, her own son becoming president just like her husband, John Quincy Adams. So I have the greatest respect for Abigail Adams as well. So what's the next question?
All right. So next up, if Congress voted in favor of independence on July 2nd, 1776, then why do we celebrate the birth of the nation on July 4th?
Do you know the answer to this?
I do actually know the answer to this.
Well, then I would like to hear you answer this question.
So July 2nd is when they had voted, but they hadn't actually finished signing everybody's name to it. So while the vote was in, they hadn't all attached their name to it. And so basically anyone who is going to be voting for this needs to attach their name to it. You know, if we're all going to be hung, let's be hung together.
Right. What did Franklin said? Unless we hang together, we will surely hang separately.
Yeah.
Yeah. John Adams argued probably most of his life, or a good part of his life, that the date of independence should have been July the 2nd, because that is when Congress voted for the passage. And it was passed by the vote. But as you said, it wasn't officially ratified until the majority of Congress signed their name. Now, there were still people, it took them a while because they were not there in Philadelphia, and they had to get back to Philadelphia and sign it. So there were some who didn't sign it. but the vast majority of Congress signed the Declaration on July the 4th. And that is why we celebrate it to this day. Now, why did John Hancock do what he did?
He wanted King George to be able to see it without his spectacles.
So what is it that he did? That he did?
John Hancock, and this is where the phrase "place here, John Hancock," decided to sign the biggest signature out of everyone on the document. He put his name very large, very prominent in the center of the document. Well, the center of the signing area of the document at the top.
Very good. Excellent. Boy, I am impressed with your knowledge.
Oh, yeah. I've seen National Treasure. I know.
You're quite the historian. Very good. All right. What's next?
All right. So next, we've got John Quincy Adams declared during the armistice clause before the Supreme Court, "If it means civil war, then let it come. It may be the final battle of the American Revolution." Why did Lincoln call the Civil War a new birth of freedom?
Well, it was during the, just to clarify, the Amistad Supreme Court discussion. And if you ever watch the movie Amistad, you'll know what we're talking about. And I highly recommend. That is a very accurate film about what happened to the Amistad Africans in their trying to break free. They were illegally taken as slaves after the slave trade had been overturned and made illegal. And that was pushed through, as we've talked on this program before, by William Wilberforce in Great Britain. And so the nations of the Atlantic all agreed that they would stop the Atlantic slave trade. Now, there were still nations like the United States and several Caribbean island nations that still had slavery, but slavery had pretty much been done away with in Europe. Sadly, it was still being held for many, many years in Africa, and it was multiracial slavery in Africa. So in North Africa, the Muslim raiders would attack a ship on the Mediterranean or on the Atlantic, and these were called the Berbers, and or Barbers, and it was called Barbary Coast. And so they would attack, and if they won the battle, they would take all of the sailors and they would become slaves. And many of those slaves were slaves for the rest of their lives in Africa. This was also true in Turkey. So John Smith, who we know from Jamestown, you had mentioned Jamestown before, John Smith and Pocahontas. Well, John Smith had been fighting in a crusade in Eastern Europe, where the Christian armies of Western Europe were fighting the Muslim armies of Eastern Europe, just outside of Austria and Vienna. They actually were very close to the gates of Vienna, and there was a possibility that Vienna or Austria would have been a Muslim nation. And so the Christian armies pushed the Muslims back into Turkey, which is, still in Europe, but it was, a Muslim nation primarily. And during those battles, Captain John Smith, was taken prisoner by the Turks, and he was turned into a slave. And so John Smith could have lived his whole life as a slave in Turkey. But one day he was out hoeing some fields, and the overseer was not paying attention. And you don't want to do that with a military person. You want to be, fully paying attention. And John Smith took his hoe and crushed the back of the guy's skull and took the keys. And we don't know exactly the route that he took, but it's believed that he went down through probably the Red Sea, got on a ship there. Yeah.
Just so you know, your video seems to be frozen.
Oh, is it? Am I back yet?
No, you've been frozen for a little while now. I've been waiting for it to circle back around. I don't know if you can refresh that.
Yeah, I don't know that I can. So we'll just hope that it comes back up here.
Here, if you try turning off your camera and turning it back on again, that may do it.
All right. Let's try. Okay, am I back? Oh, I lost you, David. David, come on back in if you would. While David is coming back into the room, let me just finish up what I had been saying, and that was that so John Smith got a boat somewhere, and he came. So here's David again. Hello. Yeah.
Hey.
Daniel Wilbur. Hello to Daniel Wilbur, my buddy from grade school in Erie,
Oh, wow.
Pennsylvania, is with us. And he said that I'm not frozen. Kelly says I'm not frozen. Julie says I'm not frozen. So I'm just going to say I'm
guess
not
it was just
frozen.
Me.
Yeah. So at any rate, so John Smith got a boat, went around Africa, came back up to England, and almost immediately was asked to be a part of the Virginia Company, went across the Atlantic, and the rest is history. But he had been a slave. And so slavery had taken place in a lot of the Muslim countries, in Turkey, in the Middle East, in Africa. But slowly over the years, it had been eradicated, but it was still going strong in the United States. Mm-hmm. And so in the Amistad case, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court because the government under Martin Van Buren had said that they were actual slaves in, I think, in Cuba, and but the people in the North, in Connecticut, I believe, where they came in, they had said no, that these were Africans who were taken illegally. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And they were able to convince John Quincy Adams, who by this time was an old man, close to death. But John Quincy Adams, like his father, had been a very strong proponent of abolition. But they were both politicians too, so they had to walk carefully in those times. Mm-hmm. But Adams argued the case before the Supreme Court. And at the end of his argument, he said, listen, if this whole case brings us to civil war, then let it come. And may it be finally the final battle of the American Revolution. And many people, including Abraham Lincoln, and actually people on both the North and the South in the Civil War, believed that it was a second independence war, especially in the South. They called it their own second War of Independence, and their patron saint was George Washington, a great Virginian. But Lincoln, he didn't necessarily call it a War of Independence, but he did call it he believed it was the last and final battle of the War of Independence, in that it was going to give what he called in the Gettysburg Address a new birth of freedom. Mm-hmm. And we've had new births of freedom throughout our history. So the Civil War was a new birth of freedom for Black people and slaves, where they were given their freedom. Now, they went through another 80 to 100 years of Jim Crow racism after that. And there was a great struggle, and there continues to be for all of us a great struggle with regard to race in our country. But it was, as far as the law was concerned, it was a birth of freedom for them. Then we could say that women received a new birth of freedom when they were given the right to vote and to hold political office. Mm-hmm. So there have been these different places where there have been in our country a new birth of freedom. And the Civil War really was that, because what it did is it finalized something that the founding fathers did not have the political courage or will to argue. And it's understandable because they had enough on their mind. Now, I'm not in any way saying that they shouldn't have addressed slavery, but as frail human beings, which they all were, I understand why that was one thing that they didn't get to. And they allowed their sons and their daughters over the generations to grapple with. But it took the war to finally finalize and bring that new birth of freedom.
Mm-hmm. All right. All right. Next up, what ironic event of American history took place on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the adoption of Declaration of Independence?
Well, that's one of the fun things about studying history. And I know you've seen some of these because you, like me, are interested in history. Mm-hmm. But every once in a while, you see one of these things where you just say, wow, that almost looks providential. And in this case, it's hard. I know that there are plenty of cynics and skeptics out there who say it's just a coincidence. But for those who are people of faith, it's hard to not see something providential in what happened on July the 4th, Independence Day, in 1826. It was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And on that day, in the morning, John Adams died. And his last words, do you know what his last words were?
Jefferson survives.
That's right. Jefferson survives.
Is ironic because on that same day, didn't he pass away as well?
I take that back. Jefferson was the one who died first.
He said Adams survives.
No, he didn't say anything. He was in and out of consciousness. But John Adams said Jefferson survives. But in reality, Jefferson had died earlier that day. But both the dynamo or the engine, the driving force behind independence was John Adams. And the voice, at least on paper, of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, they both died on the same day, 50 years after the signing, while John Adams' son was president of the United States.
Yeah. I really can't recommend 1776 enough if you haven't seen it already.
Now, why would you say that? What is it about 1776 that you love so much?
1776 is it is a musical, so fair warning if you're not familiar with that, it's definitely in there. And if you're a fan of Boy Meets World, you'll be happy because Mr. Feeney plays John Adams. But it's interesting because it starts off, right? William Daniels. So it starts off with John Adams pushing for independence, and literally everyone in the room is telling him no. And he, the next day, is working with Benjamin Franklin, and Ben Franklin is like, I don't think it's independence they have a problem with. It seems like it's just you that they have the problem with.
You're obnoxious and disliked.
Yeah, you're obnoxious and disliked. It can't be denied. So maybe let someone else propose. And so, of course, they get Richard Henry Lee to go down to Virginia and propose the idea of independence and get
now that last
the Virginia
name
government.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it does. I feel like there was another famous Lee who was involved in
at least one. There were dozens, right? The Lees
of old Virginia.
Yes. So Richard Henry was the uncle of Robert E. Lee and the brother of Light Horse Harry Lee, which of course was Robert E. Lee's father. Mm-hmm. And Richard Henry Lee had been governor of Virginia, but he was also part of the Continental Congress. And he was the one.
Wasn't he asked to serve as governor? Wasn't he asked to serve as governor after proposing?
I believe so. I don't know if he had been governor before that as well, but I know that he left to go and serve as governor in Virginia. So the Lees were a very important and influential family in Virginia. And of course, Robert E. Lee was part of that family. So anyway, I interrupted.
No, you're fine. I will defer to your historical knowledge. I've got movie knowledge, but that's not take that with a grain of salt.
You've got some good historical knowledge too.
I do, but I definitely will defer to the man with several more degrees than I have.
2 more. Well, 2.5. 2.5.
2.5.
Yeah.
But no, and so after it's been proposed by a Virginian, that's when the other states are willing to come on board, because it's not
why
just.
Do you think that was?
Because it's not just a New England problem anymore.
Right.
It showed the other colonies, were they states at that point, or were they still considered colonies?
Colonies?
Okay. So it shows the colonies that it's not just, this is a New England thing. They're obviously just belly aching about the taxes. I've got taxes too. My taxes are too high as well. But once someone from a colony outside of New England, they can't withhold their support anymore. And so more and more people come over to the side of independence, at least being able to discuss independence, if not fully pursue it, because it's something that they can't ignore anymore.
Well, and especially because it came from Virginia, because Virginia was considered at that time, it was the first colony. We know that the English tried to plant a colony in North Carolina under Raleigh, but it was lost. And if you go to the Outer Banks, you can go watch the play called The Lost Colony. Most people, and I think they pretty much have proven it with DNA now, that at least some of that colony got taken into the Native American tribes. And then they came down through the generations. But they lost that opportunity to plant the colony. But then 30 some years later, they tried again in Jamestown, and that stuck, which is why you talked about Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown on the Yorktown Peninsula in Virginia, because that is where the colonies took hold, at least the English colonies took hold at that time. And so Virginia was they always said the first colony of Virginia. And even into the history of the United States, all the way up to Woodrow Wilson, there were several presidents that came from Virginia. So Virginia had a tremendous influence on early American, both pre-American and American history.
I believe it's 4 out of the first 5 were from Virginia, because George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams wasn't.
Right. Madison and Monroe.
And then John Quincy Adams broke that streak again. So
right.
2, then an Adams, 2, then an Adams.
Hey,
imagine if we had just kept that going.
Question in math class in high school. All right, if you have 2 Virginians and 1 Adams, and then you have 2 more Virginians, what will come next? Another Adams.
It's like follow this pattern, yeah.
Exactly right. So 1776, I actually, that along with visiting Williamsburg when I was a child, those were the things that set me on the course to my lifelong interest in history. And so it's pretty interesting that you had a similar path, although I'm sure that I influenced that to a certain degree. But if you hated it,
that really makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if I had hated it, exactly.
Yeah. Then you would have rejected it.
Oh no. And I've just got that, predisposition towards liking the historical sites and, musicals telling me history.
Yeah.
Especially, 1776 in Hamilton. It's nice getting that continuance so many years later.
Isn't it interesting that Hamilton has been such a booming success? Because a lot of people, I think most critics would have said, Lin-Manuel Miranda, you're crazy. Nobody is going to be interested in a story about the American Revolution. They did that. It was called 1776. But it was an unbelievable hit. Now, a lot of that has to do with the amazing songs.
Yeah, the songs, the choreography, and it has a story that you can root for. And it's a bittersweet story. And I feel like that it's triumphant, and it continues being triumphant even with the bittersweet ending of his passing. And so, even after he dies, his legacy carries on from there. And it's
till today.
It's hopeful. Exactly.
Yeah. I also really am, and I know that in some circles it was controversial, but I thought it was wonderful how they allowed different people of different racial backgrounds to play parts that were traditionally white men. And I think that is wonderful because it reflects the birth of freedom that happened on July 2nd, and that was ratified on July 4th. And what we celebrate this week is this birth of freedom. And what Lincoln said was really profound, and I don't think that we appreciate what it was that Lincoln was saying, and that was that this thing that we call representative democracy was a complete experiment. And there are still large parts of our world now that look on it as stupid. They think that it's untamed, it is obnoxious, it is out of control, that you can't really accomplish the great things because you don't have the control of the people. Whereas the American viewpoint is just the opposite. And that is when the people have freedom, that is when there's a whole burst of ingenuity. There's a whole burst of creativity. There's a whole burst of creative energy. And Lincoln said that, when he was giving the Gettysburg Address, he really was giving an observation. There had been, I think his name was Bates, that had done a 2.5-hour oration talking about the great Battle of Gettysburg. And he spoke in that mid-19th century oratory with all the grand gestures and all that kind of thing. And Lincoln got up there in 2.5 minutes, gave the Gettysburg Address that totally gave the meaning to all of that. So,
and in a much higher pitched voice.
Yeah, right. 407 years ago, or however he talked. Everybody said that he had a very high pitched voice. We have no idea what it really sounded like, but
yeah,
Daniel Day-Lewis did, I think, a really great job of capturing.
I loved the performance in Lincoln.
In the movie
it
Lincoln.
Was
but
amazing.
Going back to what I was saying, Lincoln said this was an experiment. Can a people govern themselves, or is this destined to blow up? Is this civil war, which is a tempest, a testing of that principle, that concept, that experiment, is it going to last, or will it be overturned with tyranny and going back away from freedom? Because slavery goes the opposite direction, and the South was fighting for slavery. There are people today who want to argue that, but you can't argue it. The only reason
they were fighting for states' rights. States' rights to what? Have
exactly.
slaves.
We're fighting for tariffs. Tariffs for what? So that we can sell our cotton, which is provided by what? Slave labor. It all goes back to slavery. And they had a desire to extend slavery out to the West Coast and then down through Mexico, all the way into Central America and South America as a massive slave-holding empire. Now imagine what would have happened with the rise of Nazism, which is what? Race-based master race in the 20th century, if there had been a massive empire in the New World that held the same beliefs. And you'd say, oh, well, they only held black slaves. Well, who's to say that would have not changed over time? Because it certainly changed in the minds of the Nazis. The same seeds that brought forth race-based slavery in America grew into full flower with the master race concepts in Nazi Germany. And so what Lincoln was saying was, we can either go that way, away from freedom, or we can eradicate slavery and truly embrace freedom across our United States. The reunited United States.
Thank God they didn't deal with the name change to the reunited states.
Yeah,
it just
the
doesn't sound
reunited
as well.
States. That just doesn't work as well. But thank God that that the North won, that the Union prevailed, that slavery was done away with, and that then a United States was there to rise up with Great Britain and with all of the British Empire and the other free-fighting people against the Axis powers in World War II, which was by no way or by no means an easy victory. It was a 6-year hard-fought, millions of people died victory that took place. That was yet another worldwide rebirth of freedom, at least for a while. So any further questions for today?
No, I believe that's just about everything. It's interesting seeing how each individual war affects and like leads into the next. The French and Indian War leading to issues that caused the Revolutionary War, going into War of 1812, going into the Civil War, and then the outcomes of those things leading down the way until World War One, which led to World War Two. It's interesting seeing
which led to the Cold War, which led to where we are today.
Exactly. It's definitely interesting seeing the path that history takes.
And along those lines, Dan Wilbur said, I like Ben Franklin's answer about the congressional meeting that we have a republic if you can keep it. And Dan and Ben are absolutely right. It's something that there's a never-ending vigilance to keep freedom and to keep true freedom. Because there are some people who would want to call some things freedom when in reality they're not. And so those who believe in freedom, those who believe in the concept of representative democracy, there's a never-ending struggle. And it's one of the reasons why I do what I do, writing the books, going out and speaking, doing this Stories and Myths program, is to say, all right, this is what happened in history, which, like you so insightfully pointed out, those things back then led to where we are today. And there's a chain in life, one generation that leads to another, one event that leads to another. And then it becomes our turn to take up the banner. Exactly.
It's Russell Crowe's line in Gladiator, what we do in life echoes in eternity.
Right.
People, it's, small little tangent. It's interesting, like people in like time travel movies, they go to the past and it's like, oh, we can't step on a butterfly, we'll change the future. And it's like, that's every day of your life right now. The things that you're doing.
That is so
minor
good.
Things.
That is so good.
Like taking a stand against oppression, going out and voting, just doing your part. Those little things, they ripple out. It's like pebbles in a pond.
And it's so important for us to know what the Constitution says and what our protections are, to know that I need to protect the right of people to speak that I don't agree with. Because if I ever try to shut them up down the road, even though we might be political opposites, they might try to shut me up when they come to power. And so if we all want the opportunity to have a voice, then we all need to protect each other's right to have a voice. And right now, that's not happening. I think we're in one of the most dangerous places we've ever been in our country, because freedom of speech, even though it might offend people, even though they might see it as politically incorrect, they should still protect the right of people to say what they're saying, even though it might offend them. And that is the place of, there's never ending tension between different rights. So right now, there are people who are fighting for religious freedom against others who are fighting for freedom of certain expression. The truth is that both of them are protected under our Constitution. And so what the Congress and the President and the Supreme Court have to decide is, where do those lines meet? So the old adage is that we have freedom of speech in this country, but there are limits to that freedom. And that is
freedom, but you don't have you have freedom of speech, but you don't have freedom from the consequence of the speech.
And you don't have freedom to say certain things that can cause harm in certain places. So the old example from during World War I, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, that does not give you the right to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. If you do that, you are putting those people's lives in danger, and you therefore will, like you said, suffer the consequences of what you're saying. You don't have the right to libel somebody, or to to slander somebody. Libel is in print. Slander is to speech. But the the Supreme Court has given very wide latitude to what slander is. So slander is in danger or damaging someone's reputation, which will cause them to have a breakdown in their ability to make their living, and doing it knowing that what you're saying is wrong, and with the intent to damage. So all of those things have to be met in order for a court to give a slander justification. And so it's hard to get a slander or a libel ruling, but not impossible. And that, I think, is the beauty and the wisdom of our system.
Yeah. There's an interesting thing that I saw online. It was talking about the paradox of intolerance. We strive to be a tolerant society, but in order to be a tolerant society, we have to be intolerant of intolerance. And so, like, when Nazism rises up and they have that society of intolerance, you have to be intolerant of that specifically. In order to maintain tolerance.
Is a very tricky ground, because there are reasons why certain people are intolerant and they are deeply held. So a good example of that would be Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof. Someone would say that Tevye is intolerant against Russians and against Christians. But Tevye's point of view, and this is where our truths clash. Tevye stands, so some people would say that he's in a, intolerant place. He would say that he's standing on the traditions of the Jewish religion as he interprets them. And so in America, both sides have to be protected. And somebody might be really upset and angry at the so-called intolerance, while the person on the other side is angry that they're angry at them for their strongly held religious beliefs or political beliefs or psychological beliefs, whatever you might have, social beliefs. The truth of the matter is that our founding fathers were very wise in how they put things in place so that everybody's beliefs are protected as long as you're not causing damage to the other person. That's that is why we talk about striving for a more perfect union. It's a more perfect union. It's not a perfect union. There will never be a perfect union until the Prince of Peace returns on earth and all sin is done away with. So until then, we need to find the system that will protect everybody's rights as best as possible. And where that doesn't happen, that's where we have to rise up to defend those who are unjustly accused and their rights are taken away. It's a never-ending battle.
And that's one of the reasons we have that amendment process in place. The first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, laid down all those, inalienable rights, or unalienable if you're John Adams talking to the printer.
Right. Exactly right. And why the founding fathers made it extremely difficult to put in a new amendment, knowing that they didn't want it to just be some political wind that blows through and have the Constitution changed constantly. But when it was time for slavery to go, the amendment passed. When it was time for women to have the vote, the amendment passed. And so I thank God for our founders, because I think that they, I believe it was providential that they were led by God. But they were also led by what they had just gone through in the recent revolution, and they didn't want to go through that ever again. And they also saw what happened in the French Revolution, and they didn't want to go through that as well. So they were trying to strike a balance, and thank God, I think that they did. So, well, that's about it. Our time is up. Thank you, David, for a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad that you were able to join us tonight. And for everyone else who's been with us, we want to thank you for being with us. Remember my books. This one here is called Forward, The Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. This one here is called Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. They're available at grantvictorbook.com and grantforwardbook.com, on Amazon.com. at my website, vonbuseck.com, or wherever books are sold. And you can go and see the other books that I have available as well. We want to thank you for being with us. Daniel writes in, let's celebrate what we have here in America, a flawed system that is still the greatest in the world. I agree with you, Daniel. And so with that note, we want to remind you that we will be back here again next week on Thursday night, 7 p.m. Eastern time in the United States, Eastern United States time. So for David Von Buseck, for John C. Farrell, who couldn't be with us tonight, I'm Craig Von Buseck. We will see you back here next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Bye-bye.
Have a great night.